The beginning of the end. Cheryl Walker's reputation was solid, unshakable, and well-earned. At 55, she was not just another seasoned professional in the world of high finance, she was a living testament to perseverance, intellect, and dignity. A black woman who had risen through the ranks of a predominantly white, male-dominated industry, Cheryl had built her career from the ground up. From starting as an intern in the finance department of a small firm, working long nights, learning the ropes, and proving herself, she had clawed her way up to senior positions at some of the most prestigious financial institutions in the country. She was a leader respected not just for her expertise, but for her integrity. Now, Cheryl had been given the opportunity to step into a new role as the Director of Operations at Maxwell & Company, a prominent firm known for its cutting-edge financial strategies and high-profile clients. It was the kind of position that could catapult her into the upper echelons of corporate America, but Cheryl was wise. She had seen enough over the years to understand that power and respect were often not handed out freely, especially not to people who looked like her. Unlike the arrogant executives who walked in, demanding immediate respect based solely on their titles, Cheryl's approach was different. She didn't walk in as the boss. She chose to come in quietly, not with grand gestures or speeches, but as a temp analyst for a week. Her reasoning was simple but profound: the best way to understand an organization is not from the top, but from within. Cheryl wasn't interested in the sterile meetings or executive lunches. She wanted to see how the people of Maxwell & Company truly operated when the higher-ups weren't around. She wanted to understand the culture, the real challenges, the tensions, and the talents that flowed through the company's veins. The new director wasn't going to rush in and throw her weight around. She was going to observe first, and then make her move when the time was right. So, for the first few days, Cheryl kept her head down. She arrived early and stayed late, her eyes always scanning, her mind always working. She had her desk placed among the junior analysts, a place that might seem insignificant to someone else, but for Cheryl, it was an opportunity to see the company from the ground up. She wanted to know the employees who did the heavy lifting, the ones who weren't always recognized or celebrated. The ones who made things happen quietly in the background. The office was filled with a diverse array of personalities, ranging from eager young professionals to battle-hardened veterans who had seen the rise and fall of many companies. But there was one person who stood out: Kevin Morrison. Kevin was everything Cheryl had come to expect from a man like him. Mid-30s, well-groomed, with an air of cockiness that practically oozed from his every pore. A senior financial analyst at Maxwell, Kevin had been with the company for several years, and everyone around him seemed to treat him with a kind of reverence. He was vocal about his accomplishments, quick to name-drop his past successes, and even quicker to belittle others who he deemed unworthy of his attention. Cheryl had heard about him from the other employees during her first few days. His reputation preceded him. He was an expert at making himself look important, but his interactions with others, especially the women and people of color, were often laced with subtle condescension and thinly veiled insults. From the very beginning, Kevin sized Cheryl up, making assumptions based on her appearance. He saw her as just another temp, another placeholder who would be gone in a week or two. She wasn't his equal, and he made sure to let her know it without saying a word. He watched her from his corner of the office with an air of dismissive superiority. He believed that because he had been at Maxwell for years, he was better than the temporary staff, and certainly better than someone who looked like Cheryl. He wasn't the only one with this mindset, there were others, too. But Kevin's behavior was the most flagrant, the most arrogant. Over the course of the next few days, Cheryl endured Kevin's sharp, judgmental comments with a kind of practiced grace. He would pass her desk and make offhand remarks like, "I'm sure that report is coming along nicely. How long have you been working on it, again? A few hours?" His tone would always be just a little too loud, just a little too public, so others in the office could hear. The intent was clear: Kevin wanted to remind her, and everyone else, that he was in charge of the room, not her. One morning, as Cheryl worked diligently on a set of financial projections, Kevin approached her desk, his eyes scanning her computer screen. "I don't know why they make temps do such complex work," he said, chuckling to himself. "It's honestly a little insulting. It's not like you're going to stay long enough to see it through, right?" Cheryl kept her eyes on her work, her fingers dancing over the keyboard as though his words didn't faze her. But Kevin wasn't finished. His voice grew louder as he continued, "You know, temp work is more about just passing the time until something better comes along. A filler job. Not real work. You can't possibly be expected to understand the depth of this, can you?" The snide remarks came with the same sense of smugness he carried everywhere, and Cheryl felt the eyes of the office following her every movement. The other employees looked on, some uncomfortably, others with quiet amusement. Kevin wasn't subtle about the way he used his position and the power he thought he had to put people down. But Cheryl wasn't fazed. She had faced worse in her career, much worse. She had spent decades learning how to navigate toxic environments, how to silence the voices of people who thought their privilege made them untouchable. Kevin was just another obstacle in a long line of obstacles. But there was a difference this time. Cheryl wasn't here to just survive. She was here to learn, to understand, and when the time was right, to take control of the situation in a way that would make Kevin regret every word he had said. It was clear to Cheryl that Kevin didn't think she belonged. He made no effort to hide it. The way he spoke to her, the way he looked at her, the way he assumed that because she was black and a temporary employee, she couldn't possibly have the skill set or the drive to be a real player in the game, that was his mistake. Kevin didn't know it yet, but this game was about to change, and Cheryl was going to be the one who reshaped the rules. By the end of the week, Cheryl had gathered everything she needed. She had taken note of the company's strengths and weaknesses, the ways in which employees interacted with one another, the subtle tensions that ran through the workplace. And now, it was time for Cheryl to reveal who she truly was. The quiet observer would be no more. The new director of Maxwell and Company would emerge, and when she did, the power dynamic in the office would shift, permanently. The unveiling. The next morning, Cheryl walked into the office with a sense of calm determination. Kevin Morrison had no idea what was coming. His smug comments, his subtle but constant undermining of her professional worth, had been noted. The time had come to turn the tables. Cheryl wasn't interested in revenge, no, this was something deeper. It was a lesson. A lesson about respect, humility, and the consequences of underestimating someone based on preconceived biases. Cheryl had always been one to teach through action rather than words, and she knew exactly how to handle Kevin. He was so consumed by his own ego that he didn't even realize the storm that was about to hit him. Cheryl wasn't just playing the long game, she was playing it masterfully. She arrived early, as always, before the office began to fill with the usual bustle of executives and analysts getting their coffee and prepping for their busy day. But today, she wasn't heading straight to her temporary analyst desk in the back corner. Instead, she walked to the front of the office, past the rows of cubicles and conference rooms, heading directly toward the executive wing. The staff around her looked up in surprise as she passed them, the quiet confidence with which she carried herself causing heads to turn. Cheryl didn't bother to acknowledge the surprised looks, she was focused. This wasn't a social visit. This was the start of a new chapter, and everyone, Kevin especially, was about to realize just how much had changed. As Cheryl entered the glass-walled executive offices, she was met with the quiet murmur of office workers who were still trickling in. They looked at her with confusion, some clearly trying to place her face. No one, not even the most senior members of the firm, seemed to know who she was. But Cheryl wasn't here to introduce herself yet, she was here to set the stage. She made her way past the large, sleek desk at the front of the room, the seat that had once been reserved for the director, a position that was now hers. She sat in the chair behind the desk, adjusting it just slightly as if to make herself comfortable. She didn't look at the computer or any of the paperwork scattered across the desk. Her focus was not on the task in front of her, but on the power dynamic in the room. This office, this space, had been designed to inspire awe in anyone who entered. But Cheryl wasn't impressed by its cold efficiency. To her, it was merely a tool, an instrument that could be used to make things happen. She would make it work for her, not the other way around. The morning passed quietly, the employees filing in one by one, settling into their usual routines. Kevin, however, had no idea what was unfolding behind the scenes. He was sitting at his desk, scrolling through some spreadsheets, convinced that today would be like any other. He'd make his usual rounds through the office, crack a few jokes, maybe drop a condescending remark here and there, but nothing extraordinary. The thought that the temp he'd mocked for days could be the one to change his life never even crossed his mind. And then, at exactly 10 a.m., the door to the executive wing opened. Kevin was in the middle of a phone call when he glanced up and froze. Cheryl stood in the doorway, her calm yet assertive presence filling the room like an electric charge. There was a moment of silence as Cheryl stood there, eyes sweeping over the room. She wasn't in a rush, nor was she trying to draw attention to herself. But the subtle power of her entrance was undeniable. She had arrived, and the atmosphere in the room shifted the moment her heels clicked against the floor. Kevin, still on his call, barely had time to register who she was before she addressed him directly. "Good morning, Kevin," Cheryl said, her voice smooth but carrying an authority that he couldn't ignore. Kevin's hand faltered on his mouse, his call momentarily forgotten as he looked at her in shock. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He was staring at the woman he had humiliated the day before, the woman he had mocked and belittled without knowing a single thing about her. He stammered, his face flushed. "Ms. Walker, I didn't realize you were in today," he said, fumbling with the words. "I thought you were just the temp." The words, spoken without thinking, tasted bitter as soon as they left his mouth. Cheryl's gaze didn't waver. She was already making her way toward him, each step measured and deliberate. "You thought I was just the temp?" Cheryl echoed, her tone low but sharp. "That's interesting, Kevin. Very interesting." Kevin opened his mouth, but the words didn't come. He wanted to apologize, to somehow take back the things he had said, but he couldn't. His pride was already bruised, and in that instant, he felt small. He had been so certain of his superiority that he hadn't even bothered to check who the real power players were in the room. And now, the realization was sinking in. Cheryl stopped in front of him, her presence towering over him. She looked around the room briefly, her eyes sweeping over the gathered employees who had been quietly observing the exchange. Their faces were a mixture of surprise and recognition. They were all beginning to put the pieces together. "Kevin, I believe I should introduce myself properly," Cheryl said, her voice steady and unshaken. "I'm Cheryl Walker, the new Director of Operations. And from now on, I'll be running things around here." A silence fell over the room. Kevin was no longer the center of attention. In fact, it was clear to everyone in the office who was in charge now. Cheryl had stepped into her role with effortless grace, and Kevin's world had just turned upside down. There were no grand speeches or dramatic gestures. Cheryl didn't need them. Her actions spoke louder than any words could. She had already established herself as the true leader in the room, and everyone could see it. Kevin's face twisted with confusion and embarrassment. "I didn't know," he said again, but this time, the words felt weak and hollow. His earlier arrogance was gone, replaced by the cold, sinking feeling of regret. Cheryl didn't respond to his feeble apology. Instead, she turned her attention to the others in the room, making eye contact with several employees who had witnessed the exchange. "I trust you all understand the importance of respect in this office," she said, her voice carrying across the room. "No one here is above another, regardless of their position, race, or tenure. We will all work together as equals, and that includes Kevin. Kevin flinched as Cheryl's words landed with the weight of a hammer. He wasn't above anyone else. He had thought he was, but now, as Cheryl stood there, her calm but commanding presence made it clear that his time at the top was over. Cheryl gave him a pointed look before turning on her heel and walking back toward her new office. The office employees watched her leave, their eyes following her every movement. Kevin remained rooted to the spot, his mind racing. He had thought he was untouchable. He had thought his comments and his casual belittling of others had made him an authority in the office. But now, he realized how wrong he had been. Cheryl wasn't just a new director, she was a force to be reckoned with. And he had just learned the hard way that disrespecting her had consequences. The reckoning. The morning after Cheryl's revelation in the office was quiet, almost eerily so. Maxwell and Company had always been a bustling, energetic environment, but there was an undeniable shift in the air following the unveiling of Cheryl Walker as the new director of operations. Employees moved about with a bit more caution, their eyes glancing toward her office now and then, wondering what her next move would be. The events of the previous day had left an indelible mark, particularly on one person, Kevin Morrison. Kevin had always prided himself on being the center of attention, the one people turned to for answers and guidance. He had built his reputation on being the first to speak up, the one with the loudest voice in the room. But now, as he sat at his desk the morning after Cheryl's revelation, he found that his voice felt smaller, quieter, and infinitely less important. His mind replayed the moment she had walked into the office, the moment that had shattered everything he had believed about himself. Cheryl had entered that room with the kind of authority he couldn't match. She had made it clear, without a single raised eyebrow, that she was the one in charge now. And his flippant remarks? His assumptions that she was just another temp? Those words were hanging in the air like a bad smell, the kind that couldn't be swept away with a simple apology or a change of topic. Kevin had tried to sleep the night before, but the regret kept him awake. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Cheryl standing before him, her calm gaze unwavering. Her voice, smooth and composed, had cut through his bravado like a hot knife through butter. He had misjudged her completely. And now, there was nothing he could do about it. But what hurt most, what really gnawed at him, was that he had underestimated her because of the color of her skin and the temporary position she held. Kevin had always prided himself on being progressive, the kind of man who believed in equality and fairness. But in that moment, standing in front of Cheryl, he had realized the ugliness of his own biases. He had assumed she was insignificant. And he had done so without thinking, without ever considering the depth of her experience and the quiet power she carried. The office buzzed with activity around him, but Kevin couldn't focus. He kept replaying the scene in his head, imagining the way Cheryl had walked into that room, the way she had turned her gaze upon him and spoken with such assurance. He had been humiliated in front of everyone, and he knew it. His colleagues, who had always looked up to him, had seen his vulnerability for the first time. And worse, they had seen Cheryl's strength. As the day wore on, Cheryl's presence continued to weigh heavily on Kevin. She hadn't addressed him directly after that first confrontation, but her words from the previous day lingered. He had expected some kind of fallout, some punishment for his behavior. But Cheryl didn't seem interested in exacting revenge. No, she had a different plan in mind, one that would hit Kevin harder than any reprimand could. Cheryl had always known that the most effective way to make people like Kevin understand their shortcomings was to allow them to see the truth of their actions. She didn't need to engage in petty confrontations or drama. She simply needed to give Kevin enough rope to hang himself. The next few days passed, and Kevin found himself in a strange limbo. He wasn't quite sure what his role in the office was anymore. Cheryl hadn't changed the way she interacted with him, but he could feel the shift. He had always assumed he was the one in control of the office dynamics, the one who called the shots behind closed doors. But now, he found himself second-guessing every interaction, wondering if Cheryl was watching him, waiting for him to slip up again. Cheryl, for her part, remained cool and composed. She had already set the wheels in motion for the changes she planned to bring to Maxwell and Company. Over the next few days, she worked quietly, behind the scenes, meeting with the department heads, reviewing the company's performance reports, and listening to employees. Cheryl had a way of making people feel heard, and they responded to her approach with openness and honesty. They spoke freely about the challenges they faced, the weaknesses they saw in the company's systems, and the potential they believed the firm had if it was led with a steady hand. But there was one person who had yet to fully acknowledge the shift in power, Kevin. One afternoon, Cheryl called him into her office. He knew this meeting was coming, but he hadn't prepared for it. He had hoped, perhaps naively, that she would let things slide, that the tension between them would eventually fade away. But Cheryl was not one to let such matters go. She wasn't holding a grudge, but she was keenly aware of what had transpired. As Kevin walked into her office, his stomach churned. Cheryl was sitting at her desk, a few financial reports spread out in front of her. She looked up at him with a quiet intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. "Kevin," she said, her voice calm but firm, "please, have a seat." He sat, trying to remain composed, but it was difficult. Cheryl's presence was both commanding and disarming at the same time. There was no hint of malice in her expression, just an unwavering sense of professionalism and authority. "I've been reviewing the latest project proposal for the Henderson account," Cheryl began, her tone all business. "I noticed some discrepancies in the numbers. Can you explain why the estimates were so far off?" Kevin swallowed hard. He had worked on the Henderson account, and he had no good excuse for the errors. He had been rushed, distracted even, but he couldn't admit that to her. His pride wouldn't allow it. "Well, there were some last-minute changes to the scope of work," he said, trying to sound confident. "I wasn't aware of all the details when I put the numbers together." Cheryl nodded, her expression unreadable. "I see," she said, taking a slow breath. "I've had a chance to speak with some of the team members who worked on this with you, and it seems they were unaware of these last-minute changes as well. Can you explain why you didn't communicate that more clearly?" Kevin's heart sank. He had always been good at deflecting blame, but this time, there was no way around it. Cheryl's questions were direct, and they cut straight to the heart of the issue. She wasn't angry, she was simply doing her job. And that made the conversation even more uncomfortable. "I should have communicated better," Kevin admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was distracted. I made some mistakes." Cheryl studied him for a moment before responding. "Mistakes happen, Kevin. But they can also be a sign of something more. If you're distracted, it might mean there's something in your environment that's preventing you from focusing fully on your work." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to sink in. "Perhaps you should take some time to reflect on what's causing those distractions." Kevin sat there, feeling exposed. He had made a mistake, and now he was being called to account for it, not with anger or harsh reprimands, but with a quiet, razor-sharp clarity that cut deeper than any reprimand ever could. Cheryl wasn't just holding him accountable for his work. She was holding him accountable for his behavior, his arrogance, and his assumptions. The conversation ended quietly, with Cheryl offering a few suggestions for how Kevin could correct the errors in the Henderson account. But the real lesson had already been delivered. As Kevin walked back to his desk, his mind was racing. Cheryl had just made him face something he hadn't wanted to acknowledge, his own complacency, his own biases, and his own arrogance. He had assumed his place in the office was secure, that he was untouchable. But Cheryl had proven that no one was above scrutiny, not even him. And that realization was the first step toward his own growth. It was a reckoning he would not soon forget. The transformation. The days following Cheryl's quiet but powerful lesson had an unusual energy about them. The entire office seemed to breathe differently, as though a shift had occurred beneath the surface, one that had yet to fully reveal itself but was undeniably present. Kevin Morrison was not the only one feeling the aftershocks. Cheryl had come into Maxwell and Company with a purpose, and her strategy was clear: to lead with purpose, integrity, and an unwavering commitment to respect. But what no one had anticipated was the ripple effect her leadership style would have on the rest of the team. Kevin, for his part, was struggling with the aftermath of his encounter with Cheryl. Though his pride had taken a bruising blow, something in him had started to change. He wasn't entirely sure what that something was, but every day he sat at his desk, he found himself reflecting more and more on the way he had treated Cheryl. In the quiet moments, when he was alone with his thoughts, he began to admit to himself that perhaps he had been too quick to judge her. Maybe it wasn't just about her ability to do the job, but something deeper, something more powerful: her presence, her confidence, her ability to lead without needing to dominate. Cheryl, meanwhile, wasn't concerned with Kevin's transformation. She knew that if he was going to change, it had to come from within him. What mattered more was the way the rest of the team was responding to her leadership. She was getting a sense of how her initial decision to start as a temp had impacted the people around her. Some were quietly relieved. They felt that the power dynamic had shifted in a way that was long overdue. No one could assume that their position in the office was secure just because they had been there the longest, or because of some outdated hierarchy. Cheryl's presence reminded everyone that merit and respect were the true foundations of any successful company, not seniority or blind allegiance. In her meetings with the department heads, Cheryl made it clear that her approach was not to be one of top-down decision-making. She didn't want to come in and impose her way of doing things. Rather, she wanted to understand the pulse of the company and let the talented employees within it shine. And shine they did. Cheryl discovered talents in her team that had long been overlooked or ignored. People were starting to feel seen, heard, and appreciated in ways they hadn't before. The once distant senior managers were beginning to trust Cheryl's vision for the company and were working collaboratively with her to implement the changes that were needed. But for Kevin, the reality of his new position in the office was taking shape in a far more personal way. The days after Cheryl's pointed conversation were full of quiet reflection. He had hoped he could simply put the awkwardness behind him, but it wasn't so easy. He had learned more in the past week than he had in years. Cheryl had left an indelible mark on him, not just professionally, but personally. Her quiet strength had cracked through the arrogance he had built up over the years. For the first time in his career, he realized that his actions had consequences, and those consequences didn't just affect the people around him, they could affect his entire career. Despite this internal reckoning, Kevin was not one to show his vulnerability easily. He wasn't about to admit to Cheryl that he had learned something from her. But Cheryl had a way of seeing things that others didn't. She had watched Kevin closely, not out of spite, but out of a desire to understand how he would adapt. She knew the ego of a man like Kevin would take time to crack, but when it did, the transformation could be profound. One morning, Cheryl called Kevin into her office again. Kevin, feeling a sense of dread mixed with anticipation, walked in quietly. He had spent the past few days trying to reframe his approach at work, trying to be more patient with his colleagues, more mindful of his words. But it wasn't easy. There were moments when his old self came rushing back, when he felt the impulse to show off, to prove his worth. He wasn't sure how Cheryl was going to approach him this time. But he couldn't deny that her presence had changed something in him. He felt smaller, yes, but he also felt a strange sense of humility that he had never known. Cheryl didn't waste time with pleasantries. She got straight to the point. "Kevin, I've been noticing a shift in your behavior," she said, her tone calm but focused. "You've been quieter lately. You're listening more. And you're working with your team in a way that shows a different side of you." Kevin shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but Cheryl continued without waiting for him to speak. "I want you to know that this shift, this reflection, is a good thing. But I also need you to understand that this is not about me. It's about your growth. You've been so focused on proving yourself, on projecting a version of yourself that you think people want to see. But now, I need you to understand that real leadership doesn't come from power, it comes from service. It comes from humility. It comes from the ability to lift others up, not tear them down. Kevin swallowed hard. He had heard the words, but hearing them from Cheryl felt like hearing them for the first time. He had spent years trying to fit a mold, trying to be the smartest, the fastest, the most impressive in the room. But what Cheryl was saying was something entirely different. Real leadership wasn't about standing at the front and demanding respect, it was about earning it by putting others first. He didn't say anything at first. His thoughts were too tangled, too raw. But finally, after what felt like an eternity of silence, he spoke. "I've been trying to figure it out," he admitted, his voice quieter than usual. "I've been trying to understand what went wrong, why I felt the need to act the way I did. And I think I've been afraid. Afraid of being seen as weak. Afraid that if I wasn't constantly asserting myself, people wouldn't respect me." Cheryl nodded, her expression softening. "We all have fears, Kevin. The difference is whether we let those fears define us or whether we choose to grow past them. The greatest leaders are the ones who can overcome their own insecurities and help others rise with them." There was a long pause, and Kevin felt as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He wasn't entirely sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt open to change. The conversation shifted toward practical matters, and Cheryl began to outline her vision for some of the changes she planned to implement at Maxwell. Kevin listened carefully now, not because he wanted to impress her, but because he was starting to realize that his growth depended on his ability to listen and learn from those around him. He had a long road ahead, but for the first time, Kevin felt like he was ready to walk it, not as the arrogant senior analyst who looked down on others, but as a partner in the process of transformation. As the meeting came to a close, Cheryl stood and extended her hand toward Kevin. "I'm glad to see you're taking this seriously," she said. "Let's work together to make Maxwell better, not just as a company, but as a place where people can grow, learn, and thrive." Kevin shook her hand, his grip firm but respectful. He had come a long way in the past few days, and though he knew there was much more to learn, he felt a sense of responsibility. Cheryl wasn't just changing the company, she was changing him. As he walked back to his desk, Kevin's thoughts were clearer than they had been in a long time. He had come to realize that his journey had only just begun, and it wasn't about proving himself anymore. It was about becoming the kind of leader who could earn respect, not through arrogance, but through authenticity. And for that, he would need to change the way he saw everything, starting with himself. The path forward. The days following Cheryl's meeting with Kevin were filled with subtle but unmistakable changes. Kevin had not just learned a lesson in humility, he had begun a process of transformation. It wasn't something he could achieve overnight, but he had started to walk a new path. And as he moved through the halls of Maxwell and Company, he was no longer the same man who had arrogantly belittled his new boss just a few short days ago. Cheryl's quiet leadership had done more than change his perspective, it had ignited something within him, a desire to be better, to truly contribute to the growth of the firm and the people around him. Kevin was not the only one undergoing changes. Cheryl's decision to lead with empathy, to listen before speaking, and to act with integrity had a ripple effect throughout the office. It was as though a weight had been lifted off the shoulders of the employees who had long been used to a culture of hierarchy and top-down leadership. The shift was subtle at first, but over time, it became undeniable. People were starting to speak more freely, share ideas without fear of retribution, and collaborate in ways that hadn't happened before. Cheryl had created an environment of trust, and that trust was slowly rebuilding the foundation of Maxwell and Company. It wasn't easy, of course. Transforming a corporate culture, especially one as deeply ingrained as the one at Maxwell, took time. Cheryl knew this. But she was patient. She had seen firsthand how small changes could snowball into something far greater. She had no interest in a quick fix. She wanted a sustainable shift in culture, one that would endure long after her time at the company was done. The morning after her meeting with Kevin, Cheryl found herself sitting in her office, reviewing the company's long-term goals. There was so much to be done, and while the interpersonal dynamics were shifting, there was still the matter of the firm's performance, its growth and profitability. Cheryl was keenly aware that without addressing these metrics, her leadership would be viewed as ineffective, regardless of how much people enjoyed working for her. But Cheryl wasn't interested in simply increasing profits at the cost of her team's well-being. Her leadership philosophy had always been holistic. She believed that when people were treated with respect and given the tools they needed to succeed, both professionally and personally, the company would thrive. And she was committed to proving that approach could work at Maxwell. One of the first things she did was meet with the head of HR, Laura, to discuss employee engagement. "Laura, we need to make sure we're listening to our people. They're the ones on the front lines, working with clients, solving problems, and making things happen. We need to know what's working, what's not, and what can be improved." Laura nodded enthusiastically. "I completely agree, Cheryl. But it's going to take some time to change the way people think. The old mindset runs deep around here. Some people are used to being told what to do and following orders without question." Cheryl smiled, understanding Laura's concern. "That's exactly why we need to start with the small wins. We need to create a culture where people feel empowered to speak up, to ask questions, and to offer suggestions. We need to get the leadership team on board, too." And so, Cheryl set the wheels in motion. Over the next few weeks, she worked closely with HR to introduce a series of initiatives aimed at improving employee satisfaction, from open-door policies for senior management to quarterly feedback sessions. She introduced regular team-building exercises designed to break down barriers and foster collaboration. But perhaps most importantly, Cheryl worked on changing the way the leadership team interacted with the rest of the company. Kevin, despite his initial misgivings, was beginning to see the value in Cheryl's approach. While he had once seen himself as the loudest voice in the room, now he was learning to be more patient, more deliberate in his decision-making. He began to see that leadership was about empowering others, not just asserting his own authority. He didn't have to have all the answers. In fact, sometimes the best leaders were the ones who asked the right questions. It wasn't an easy transition for Kevin. Old habits died hard, and there were moments when he found himself slipping back into the same patterns, when he wanted to dominate the conversation, to prove he was still the expert. But Cheryl had created a safe environment in which he could fail without fear of judgment. And slowly, Kevin began to change his approach. He stopped talking over people in meetings and started listening. He began to delegate tasks more effectively, allowing his team to take ownership of their work. And as he did, he began to notice something remarkable: his team respected him more. They trusted him more. One afternoon, Cheryl asked Kevin to join her for a lunch meeting with a potential client. It was an important account, and Cheryl wanted Kevin to see firsthand how she handled such high-stakes negotiations. They sat across from the client at a sleek conference table, discussing the firm's future goals and how Maxwell and Company could provide value to their business. Cheryl listened carefully, asking thoughtful questions and offering insight that showed both her expertise and her ability to understand the client's needs. Kevin, sitting beside her, watched closely. He was struck by how effortlessly Cheryl navigated the conversation, how she never felt the need to assert her authority. She simply let her knowledge and experience speak for itself. As the meeting ended and they walked back to the office, Kevin found himself reflecting on the experience. "You're amazing in those meetings," he said, half in awe. "You didn't try to sell them anything. You just listened, asked the right questions, and gave them what they needed." Cheryl smiled, but it wasn't a smile of self-satisfaction. It was a knowing smile, the smile of someone who understood what it meant to lead with purpose. That's because leadership is about service, Kevin. It's about putting the needs of others first. The more we focus on understanding and helping others, the more successful we will be. As they walked back into the office, Cheryl could see the change in Kevin's demeanor. He wasn't the same person he had been when she first arrived at Maxwell. And although she had known all along that he was capable of this transformation, seeing it in real time was both gratifying and encouraging. Back in the office, things were beginning to shift on a larger scale. Cheryl's leadership was creating a ripple effect, one that was changing how people thought about their roles at Maxwell and Company. Employees were taking more initiative, collaborating in ways they hadn't before, and stepping up in leadership roles where they had once been hesitant. Even the senior management team was beginning to follow Cheryl's example, creating an atmosphere where trust and communication were becoming the foundation of the company's culture. It wasn't all smooth sailing, of course. There were still challenges to overcome, especially in a high-stakes industry like finance, where performance metrics were often prioritized over interpersonal dynamics. But Cheryl was patient. She knew that true change took time. And while some employees were still skeptical, the ones who had bought into her vision were already seeing results. The company was becoming more efficient, more collaborative, and, most importantly, more human. And through it all, Kevin continued to grow. He became a quieter, more thoughtful leader, one who empowered his team instead of trying to control them. Cheryl had given him the tools to succeed, and now it was up to him to put those lessons into practice. The work wasn't finished yet. There were still hurdles to jump, challenges to face. But Cheryl had already made a profound impact at Maxwell and Company, and she wasn't stopping now. She had proven that leadership wasn't about titles or power, it was about influence, respect, and the ability to bring out the best in others. The real work, Cheryl knew, was just beginning. But she was ready for whatever came next.